Next, from the Abraham Lincoln Association's annual dinner, Senator Dick Durbin delivers the keynote address and shares how Lincoln is memorialized in the nation's capital, and why his crisis leadership still inspires those in government. Senator Durbin is introduced by former Illinois state historian Tom Schwartz. This runs about 40 minutes.
Thank you, Bob. It's good to be back. Our speaker tonight holds a high distinction that Abraham Lincoln sought but never achieved, that as United States Senator from Illinois. As many of you may recall, Lincoln tried for the seat in 1855, only to throw his support behind Lyman Trumbull, an anti-slavery Democrat who later joined the Republican Party, over Joel Madison, a pro-slavery Democrat. Trumbull was married to Mary Todd Lincoln's best friend, Julia Jane. And the fallout from Lincoln giving up the Senate race to save the seat for an anti-slavery candidate was pragmatic and principled politics. But Mary never forgave Trumbull or his wife for stealing the Senate seat from her husband. In 1858, Lincoln placed Illinois in the national spotlight by challenging the incumbent, Senator Stephen A. Douglas, to a series of 7 debates. Lincoln lost that bid as well, but his strong debate performance helped position him as a presidential candidate 2 years later. And the rest, as they say, is history. Richard Joseph Durbin is the senior United States Senator from Illinois. He continues a long and distinguished tradition among Illinois senators, such as Paul Douglas and Paul Simon, of being a devoted student of the Lincoln story and a tireless advocate for supporting Lincoln's ongoing legacy. It should come as no surprise that Durbin worked for both Paul Douglas as an intern and Paul Simon during his tenure as lieutenant governor. Holding the second highest ranking position in the Senate, that as majority whip, Senator Durbin has the Washington distinction as being a person of influence. Like Lincoln, Senator Durbin champions issues such as infrastructure and banking reform. This is in keeping with Lincoln's view: the legitimate object of government is to do for a community of people whatever they need to have done, but cannot do at all or cannot do so well do for themselves in their separate and individual capacities. His support of all things Lincoln is legendary. Throughout the planning, construction, and completion of the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum, Senator Durbin was an invisible presence, making certain that the project moved forward swiftly and successfully. More importantly, Durbin was concerned that the larger Springfield community would be prepared for the sea change created by the Library Museum. His urging led to the creation of the Springfield Readiness Committee that oversaw the directional signage was in place, storefronts were given fresh coats of paint, and merchants were given brooms to make a clean sweep of the historic district. The success of the museum contributed greatly to enhancing Illinois' Lincoln legacy. 2 other projects worth noting are Senator Durbin's leadership, along with former Illinois Congressman Ray LaHood, in promoting the Lincoln Bicentennial. It's safe to say that President Barack Obama's appearance at this gathering in Springfield back on February 12, 2009, was the result of Dick Durbin's persuasive powers. He introduced legislation resulting in the creation of the Abraham Lincoln National Heritage Area, 42 counties in central Illinois that preserve the cultural assets and stories connected with Abraham Lincoln and his times. The remarkable feature of Senator Durbin is that he remains strongly connected to his roots. The son of a railroad worker and an immigrant mother from Lithuania, Durbin learned the lessons of hard work and why America remains an inspiration and magnet for people around the world seeking freedom and opportunity. Unlike Lincoln, Durbin attended Georgetown University, working on the railroads during his summer vacations to pay for his education, and later, law school. His political accomplishments are considerable, and he remains one of the most important political figures on the national scene. The political culture in Illinois and nationally tends to think of power as something to acquire to burnish one's own accomplishments and individual legacy. Yet most of us in this room think of Senator Durbin more as the loving husband and father, the friendly neighbor, the concerned citizen, and the approachable elected official who's interested in using political power to help those in need and not advance his own career. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the senior United States Senator from Illinois, Springfield's own Dick Durbin.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you very much. Thanks, everybody. Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you. Thanks, Tom, for the great introduction, and it is good to have you back in Springfield. I also want to thank Abraham Lincoln Association President Bob Lenz, a friend of 4 decades, and all the members of the Association's Board of Directors and distinguished guests and scholars. I know she has been recognized, but I will tell you the first time I ever attended one of these dinners was with the father of our Lieutenant Governor, Paul Simon, who of course was a Lincoln author himself and quite a student of that great president. I'll acknowledge as well Springfield Mayor Mike Houston and Carolyn. Thank you so much for being here this evening and tolerating more and more speeches by Durbin than you've ever been asked to face in any given weekend. Dr. Lee, I want to tell you that I listened closely to your invocation, and I could hear the whispered gratitude of so many people here who thanked God Almighty for TiVo so they wouldn't miss Downton Abbey when they get home later on this evening. 1996, when I announced that I was running for the United States Senate, the head of the speech department at Eastern Illinois University said, "I've got a great idea. Why don't we have a Lincoln-Douglas style debate between you and the Republican Al Salvi? We'll do it at the Coles County Fairgrounds at the same spot where Lincoln and Douglas debated." Well, we negotiated back and forth, and the professor had some ideas that we had to disabuse him of. He wanted it to be authentic. And to be authentic, we were each going to give a 1-hour opening statement followed by a 30-minute rebuttal. Well, we collapsed that to a much tighter schedule. And Loretta and I went over that day. If you'll remember, when we arrived at the fairgrounds and met Al Salvi and his wife, and they put us in a horse-drawn carriage and took us to the stage where this was going to take place. It was going to be as authentic as possible. The people in the audience, friends of mine, friends of Al Salvi's, were going to just press right up against us, literally right in front of us as we were speaking. So that was a little different. And we called on our son, Paul, who was then 26 years old, a freshly minted lawyer, to introduce me. Now, what can be wrong with that? A son introducing his father? He got up and he said, "Dick Durbin is my dad," and a fellow standing right in front of him said, "He's a crook." That was the beginning of the debate, but even more unsettling, I guess, was when I got up to speak and I looked behind me and there was a row of at least 12 Lincoln impersonators in every possible shape and size, some of whom the following Saturday would have been at the Mattoon Holiday Inn Elvis impersonation too. They were ready for all occasions. Well, let me tell you, even more unnerving than looking at a lineup of Lincoln lookalikes is to look out at a room of eminent Lincoln scholars and think that I'm going to give a speech to you about this great man. Your work has helped everyone in America understand this great president a little better. Tonight, I'm going to speak about one Lincoln topic about which I may know more than most, if anyone, in this room, and that is what it's like for me to walk in Lincoln's footsteps in the United States Capitol and the United States Senate chamber. There never was a Senator Abraham Lincoln, as Tom reminded us, though he tried twice, and of course lost his bid in 1858 running against Stephen Douglas. My love for Lincoln stems partly from his early record of electoral failure. You see, I I lost 3 elections before I ever won one. And it was ironic that I won my first election in 1982 to the U.S. House of Representatives, succeeding a true Lincoln scholar and a man who has become a very close friend, Paul Findley, an extraordinarily good man. I spent a dozen years in the House representing many of the same communities that Lincoln represented, including our shared hometown of Springfield. I'm reminded of Lincoln's years when I walk through the U.S. Capitol and go to Statuary Hall. Many of you have been there, and you know that there is a little bronze marker on the floor for every member of the U.S. House who went on to be elected president. In the back of the room is the marker with Abraham Lincoln's name and the number 191, his desk number. Lincoln was at that desk in February 1848 when then Congressman and former President John Quincy Adams, who was known as Old Man Eloquent for his anti-slavery speeches, was stricken while seated at his desk. Adams was carried into the nearby offices of the House Speaker, where he lingered for 2 days before he passed away. Lincoln served on the committee. This brand new congressman was on the committee to organize the funeral. It was from that desk in the old House chamber where this new Congressman Lincoln gave a famous speech about the so-called spot resolutions, questioning the constitutionality of the Mexican-American War, demanding to know the very spot where the hostilities began. That wasn't well received back in Illinois. The Chicago Times claimed that Lincoln, quote, made himself ridiculous and odious in giving aid and comfort to the Mexican enemy. Though a brand new congressman, Lincoln didn't avoid controversy. He did something that most congressmen didn't do in those days. He took his family to Washington. Congressman Lincoln, with his wife Mary and their 2 small sons, 3.5-year-old Robert and 1-year-old Eddie, lived in a single large room in Mrs. Ann Sprague's boarding house. That's where the Library of Congress stands today, just across the street from the Capitol. When he walked to work to the Capitol, he walked through a cow pasture, where literally the cows were grazing on what is now the Capitol lawn. The Lincoln boys were notoriously spirited, as they said in those days. In modern parlance, we'd say they were undisciplined. The other boarders were apparently not too disappointed when Mary Todd Lincoln announced after a year she'd had it living in this boarding house, picked up, moved the family, her kids, to her father's home in Lexington, Kentucky for the remainder of Abraham Lincoln's term. Lincoln was lonely after the departure, did a lot of reading, did pass some time, though, with the residents of the boarding house in an alleyway behind the boarding house of a home owned by James Casparis on A Street Southeast, where he would be bowling outside. He was, we're told, a very awkward bowler, but always drew a crowd because of the stories that he just kept on telling nonstop. It was during these house years that Lincoln first came face to face with the reality of human slavery. When you look at his biography, people talk about the flatboat trip to New Orleans and his first vision of slaves. Perhaps he saw them as a child in Kentucky or in other places, but there is a recognition that at that moment, when he was serving in the U.S. House of Representatives, slavery was in front of his face every single day. Slave markets and slave pens literally dotted the National Capitol Mall. Indeed, slave auctions were so close to the Capitol that the voices of patriotic representatives boasting of freedom and equality and the rattling of poor slaves' chains almost commingled. Recalled Solomon Northup, a freedman who was kidnapped and sold into slavery in Washington in the 1840s. During his final year in the House, with the encouragement of another of Mrs. Sprague's boarders, the abolitionist statesman and Ohio Congressman Joshua Giddings, Lincoln introduced a bill to end slavery in the District of Columbia. It failed, but stay tuned. Something more was to happen on that front. Now, when we think of Lincoln in Washington, it's usually those House years, or most likely his White House years, that come to mind. But Lincoln left a mark in the U.S. Senate. In fact, I can't walk far in the Capitol without encountering a place where Lincoln walked before me, a place where he sat to sign bills, a place where he stood to address the nation or to rest at the end of his labors. The floors in the office that I have in the United States Capitol, and much of the Capitol itself, are covered in brightly colored, elaborately patterned encaustic tiles manufactured by the firm of Minton, Hollis & Company in Staffordshire, England. They were installed in the new Senate wing of the Capitol between 1856 and 1859, brand new for the new Lincoln president. In some of the less traveled halls, these Minton tiles are as vivid today as they were 150 years ago. In other areas, the millions of visitors in the Capitol have worn a trail erasing the patterns. I think about Lincoln and all those who preceded him and followed that same path. On the first floor of the Senate side of the Capitol, I passed the old Supreme Court chamber, where in 1849, as a congressman, Lincoln argued and lost his one and only case before the U.S. Supreme Court. The ruling was handed down by Chief Justice Taney, author of the infamous Dred Scott decision. 12 years later, of course, the tables were turned, and Chief Justice Taney administered the oath of office to the new president from Illinois, a frequent critic of the Dred Scott decision. 50 feet away from the old Supreme Court chamber in the Capitol crypt is the massive bust of Lincoln's head carved by Gutzon Borglum, famous for his Mount Rushmore images. Passing through the new Capitol's Visitor Center, which I commend to you, we're very proud of it, I see displayed the solemn black catafalque on which Lincoln's casket rested during his state funeral in the Capitol building. In July of 2009, that same catafalque was moved into the United States Senate chamber to bear the casket of Senator Robert Byrd of West Virginia, the longest-serving member of Congress in our nation's history. One can't help but feel watched as you walk through the Capitol today. Every few feet, another bust, another statue, another painting memorializing the pantheon of great Americans. And more than almost any other individual, one finds the watchful gaze of the great emancipator. In my office in the Capitol hangs a massive portrait of Lincoln by George Peter Alexander Healy. Robert Todd Lincoln said of it, "I've never seen a portrait of my father which is to be compared with it in any way." It is a study for the peacemakers, Healy's larger group portrait of Lincoln and his military commanders near the end of the war. Healy is believed to have done this original life sketches for the large work at the White House in 1864. Identical copies of this painting hang in the State Dining Room at the White House, at the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum here in Springfield, and the Newberry Library in Chicago. That painting is on loan to my office from the Chicago History Museum. It's one of four, as I mentioned. It just returned. It's a well-traveled work of art. It just returned from an exhibit in Moscow, celebrating the friendship between Lincoln, the president who abolished slavery, and Alexander II, the czar who ended serfdom, a friendship that proved crucial during the Civil War. Some of you may have been in my personal office, in the whip's office in the Capitol, and there's a painting above my desk there which has a great story. It was painted by Freeman Thorpe, an Ohio artist who had an even greater gift for timing than for painting. On February 15, 1861, Thorpe was at the train station in his hometown of Geneva, Ohio, waiting to see Lincoln's inaugural train pass by. Mechanical problems surfaced. The train had to make an unscheduled stop. Thorpe grabbed his pencil and a piece of cardboard, and the 17-year-old got within 10 feet of the president-elect and started making sketches. His sketches from that day, believed to be the only likeness drawn of Lincoln from his life during his inaugural journey to Washington, now belong to the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum. A little over 2 years later, another twist of fate would place Freeman, then a Union soldier, just feet away from President Lincoln as he delivered his address at Gettysburg. In 1879, in an artist's studio in the U.S. Capitol, a few feet, incidentally, from where my office is located, Thorpe combined his sketches and notes from these events, along with photographs and interviews, and began to paint the oil portrait that now hangs in my office. He continued revising it for 41 years, until 1920, when he sold it to the Joint Committee of the U.S. Senate Library for $2,000. Today, just below Thorpe's painting, I have my mother's naturalization papers framed, sitting on the credenza, a constant reminder of my heritage and the heritage of our nation of immigrants. I like to think that Lincoln, who bravely opposed the know-nothings, the anti-immigrant voices of his day, would approve. In the 6 decades between 1800, when the Capitol moved to Washington, and 1860, when Lincoln was elected president, the number of states in the Union nearly doubled to 33. Putting it in perspective, imagine if America had expanded from 50 to 100 states in the years since John Kennedy. When Lincoln returned to Washington as president-elect in March of 1861, work had not yet finished on the new wings of the Capitol, built to accommodate all these new senators and representatives. The Capitol building was surrounded by work sheds and bustling with craftsmen and laborers. On his first inaugural day, Lincoln made his trip to the Capitol in an open carriage with outgoing President James Buchanan, who turned to him and said, "If you are as happy in entering the White House as I shall feel on returning to Wheatland, Pennsylvania, you are a happy man." Upon reaching the Capitol, Lincoln went first to the Senate chamber to witness the swearing-in of his vice president, Maine Senator Hannibal Hamlin. In those days, the vice president gave his own inaugural address. There's something Joe Biden would like. But this address was comfortably indoors to the senators over whose debates he would preside. Presidents, then as now, delivered their inaugural addresses outside. On that blustery day, as Lincoln took the oath as America's 16th president, he faced a more ominous threat than cold weather. Rumors of assassination plots, of Southern plans to seize the Capitol and prevent Lincoln's inaugural had put the Army on high alert. Washington looked like an armed camp. Lincoln was visibly nervous. When he reached the inaugural stand, the newspaper reporter Benjamin Perley Poore noticed that he seemed perplexed about what to do with his new silk hat and his gold-headed cane. He put the cane under the table in front of him, but the hat appeared too good to place on the rough-hewn boards of the inaugural platform. Seeing his predicament, Lincoln's old rival, Stephen Douglas, graciously took the shining hat from its bothered owner and held it as Lincoln appealed for national unity. Proof that civility can endure, even in times of terrible political stress and division. That is a timely lesson for those of us serving in Congress today. Stephen Douglas had long differed with Lincoln on the issue of slavery, but after the election, he gave the president his pledge of support. And when Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter just weeks later, Douglas' loyalty was never in doubt. He traveled across the Midwest, making speeches to rally Northern Democrats to support the Republican president. Addressing the Illinois State Legislature here in Springfield, Douglas said, "You all know I'm a very good partisan figure in partisan times, and I trust you'll find me equally a good patriot when the country's in danger." The legislators gave him a standing ovation. Sadly, barely a month later, Douglas died at the Tremont House in Chicago, worn out at the age of 48 from his strenuous effort. His death cost Lincoln an important ally in the Senate. It would be the last such loss. In Lincoln's day, when a president was inaugurated, the Senate met for about a week, just long enough to confirm his cabinet, and then adjourned until December. Lincoln changed that. On April 15, 1861, 3 days after the attack on Fort Sumter, he summoned Congress back in for an emergency session to begin on the 4th of July. He issued a proclamation calling up 75,000 volunteers to protect the Capitol and put down the insurrection. The enlistments were to last 90 days. They assumed the rebellion would be over by then. As troops began pouring into Washington, there was a problem. Where were they going to house them? Since the new House and Senate chambers were empty until July, they made the decision to turn the vacant halls into temporary bivouacs. Volunteers from Pennsylvania arrived first on April 18th, and they were quartered in the House chamber. On that first night in the Capitol, the troops looked up to see the tall and unmistakable figure of President Abraham Lincoln entering the chamber. They gave him a rousing reception. The following day, volunteers arrived from Massachusetts after a much harder and dangerous journey. Pro-secessionist mobs had attacked the troops in Baltimore. Several soldiers and rioters had been killed. Arriving at the Capitol, bloodied and exhausted, the Massachusetts volunteers were quartered in the Senate chamber, the same one where I go to work. Most of them fell immediately to the floor to sleep. Others of their wounded comrades were cared for in the nearby Supreme Court chamber and the rotunda, which became a military hospital. The next morning, the volunteers were jolted awake by fife and drum reveille in the Senate chamber and mustered out on the lawn to be inducted into the United States Army. I sometimes wonder if the fife and drum might help us get up and go to work once in a while in the Senate. When they weren't drilling on the Capitol lawn, the soldiers carried on mock debates in the Senate. enacting their own laws. One overly enthusiastic Union soldier shoved his bayonet into the side of the desk once occupied by Jefferson Davis, the former Mississippi senator, then president of the Confederacy. The desk was spared by a doorkeeper who jumped up and reminded this new soldier that he'd been sent to Washington to protect government property and not to destroy it. These days, Mississippi Senator Thad Cochran sits at that desk and will proudly show you the mahogany patch that covers the hole gouged in by that Union soldier's bayonet. I sit at my own desk in that Senate chamber, sometimes think about the Civil War soldiers who rested on that floor, readying themselves for battle. During the Civil War, some senators raised regiments from the states and served as military officers, and among them was Edward Dickinson Baker. Most of us will recall fondly the speech given to this association by Senator Mark Hatfield of Oregon about Edward Dickinson Baker and his close friendship with Abraham Lincoln. Baker represented the adopted state of Oregon in the U.S. Senate, but he lived most of his life right here in Illinois. He and Lincoln were old friends from the days when they were both attorneys here in Springfield. When Baker resigned his seat in Congress to lead his men in the Mexican-American War, Lincoln succeeded in Congress, that same congressional seat. Lincoln so admired Baker that he named his second son, Eddie, in his friend's honor. In October of 1861, 7 months into Lincoln's presidency, Edward Baker was killed while leading his regiment in a disastrous encounter at the Battle of Ball's Bluff, 30 miles south of Washington. This time, Lincoln had not just lost an ally in the Senate, but a dear friend. 6 weeks later, the gaunt and grieving president attended a memorial service for his fallen friend in that same Senate chamber and wept audibly. Stephen Douglas' seat was filled by Orville Browning, a Quincy Republican and longtime Lincoln friend who was close to both the president and the First Lady. In 1863, however, the legislature, controlled by the Democrats here in Springfield, decided to send William Richardson, an ally of the Ohio Peace Democrat and Lincoln critic Clement Vallandigham. Illinois' other Senate seat, meanwhile, was occupied by a man whose name has been mentioned this evening, Lyman Trumbull, who, although a Republican, was often harshly critical of what he regarded as Lincoln's timidity in rooting out slavery. For most of his presidency, when Lincoln sought new allies to replace those he lost, he had to look beyond his fellow Illinoisans. Lincoln was pained by the carnage of war and often looked for any reasonable excuse to commute the death sentences of soldiers condemned for desertion and lesser infractions. One old friend said that Lincoln was tender-hearted as a girl at such cases. On January 19th, 1863, the President and Mrs. Lincoln came to the Senate chamber to hear a dramatic reading of a poem about one such soldier. The Sleeping Sentinel tells the story of William Scott, a soldier from Vermont, fell asleep on guard duty, sentenced to die. It reaches its dramatic climax as Scott is awaiting death by a firing squad. And the poem reads, "Then suddenly was heard the sounds of steed and wheels approach, and rolling through a cloud of dust appeared a stately coach. On past the guards and through the fields its rapid course was bent, till halting mid the lines was seen the nation's president. He came to save that stricken soul now awaking from despair, and from 1,000 voices rose a sound which rent the air. The pardoned soldier understood the tones of jubilee, and bounding from his fetters blessed the hand that made him free." I have seen tragic, comic, and even farcical moments in the Senate, but I can't think of a comparable time when a president has been called and saluted on the floor of the United States Senate. Coming just weeks after the bloody Battle of Fredericksburg, in which 17,000 soldiers on both sides perished, that evening must have been a welcome respite for Lincoln and Mrs. Lincoln. Some members of Congress, including radical abolitionists within his own party, criticized Lincoln as a weak commander-in-chief. History, I believe, has shown they were just wrong. After all those states' rights senators seceded, the president and the remaining senators and congressmen not only liberated from the slavery debate, but inspired by the notion of a united America, did some dramatic things. Passage of the National Banking Act, the Homestead Act, the Morrill Land Grant College Act, which created our own University of Illinois, and the Pacific Railroad Act enabled America to lay a foundation for a new economy and a new nation. There's one room I want to call your attention to, and if you come to the Capitol, look me up and I'll take you in to see it. It's a magnificent room just off the Senate chamber, and it's known as the President's Room. I've been to so many committee meetings there, I can't count them. It's one of the most historic rooms in the Capitol, just a few feet off the Senate chamber. It was in this room that President Lincoln signed the District of Columbia Compensated Emancipation Act, outlawing slavery in the capital city in April 1862, 15 years after his effort in the House of Representatives. It was also in this room that Dr. Martin Luther King and other civil rights leaders watched President Lyndon Johnson sign the Voting Rights Act in August of 1965, prohibiting discrimination at the polls, 100 years after Lincoln's death. And it was in this room on January 20th, 2009, that a newly inaugurated President Barack Obama signed his first official documents as President of the United States. Just as an aside, it was also in this room where Chief Justice Rehnquist was assigned a desk during the Clinton impeachment trial. He put the desk in the center of the room and sat in his chair with the doors open and welcomed all visitors. We would walk by and just talk, never about the case, but about everything else. I think it was quite a departure from the regiment across the street at the Supreme Court. In Lincoln's day, indeed, until well into the 20th century, congressional terms ended on March 4th, the same day the new Congress was sworn in. The outgoing Congress often worked long into the night on March 3rd, passing scores of in-the-session bills, and chief executives often came up to the Capitol to sign the bills at the last minute. That's what President Lincoln was doing on March 3rd, 1865, in that room, when word reached him from General Ulysses Grant that the Confederate General Robert E. Lee was seeking a peace conference to negotiate an end to the Civil War. After conferring with Secretary of War Stanton and Secretary of State Seward, Lincoln sent word back to Grant that he was not to meet with Lee, quote, unless it be for the capitulation of General Lee's army. The following day, March 4th, 1865, Lincoln returned to the Capitol for his second inauguration. Once again, he went first to the Senate chamber to witness the inauguration, this time of a new vice president, Andrew Johnson of Tennessee. Johnson was having a bad day. He was the only Southern senator to remain in the Senate when his state seceded in 1861. In recognition of that loyalty to the Union, Lincoln had made him war governor of Tennessee and then brought the Democratic Johnson into the National Union ticket in 1864. Regrettably, Johnson arrived at the Capitol ill and quickly downed several glasses of whiskey to fortify himself before delivering his vice president's address. This rambling address one onlooker described as an incoherent harangue. The spectacle embarrassed President Lincoln. Witnesses said the president's face showed unalterable sorrow. Lincoln left the Senate chamber for the last time that day and walked to the east front of the Capitol to deliver his majestic second inaugural address. In it, he looked forward to the end of the war and explained more fully why he had declined Lee's request for a negotiated settlement. Quote, with malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are on. Lincoln's features, a friend noted, were haggard with care, tempest-tossed and weather-beaten. But with the nightmare of the Civil War nearly over, the city was joyous and confident. For the first time, African-American troops marched in the inaugural parade down Pennsylvania Avenue, and blacks mingled with the inaugural crowd on the Capitol lawn. Today, you can see the table that Lincoln used for his second inauguration in our Capitol's Visitor Center in Washington. It's made from cast iron left over from the construction of the Capitol Dome. An unfinished dome had been the backdrop for Lincoln's first inaugural address. And early in his presidency, Lincoln had defied his critics who argued that we had to stop construction on that dome. It was taking too much money, too much metal, and it just wasn't the right thing to do. Lincoln said, no, we're going to finish this dome. It's a symbol of what our nation will be when this war is over. Now, at his second inauguration, the finished dome appeared to confirm his faith. 2 years earlier, a skilled ironworker named Philip Reed had overseen the bronzing of the towering Statue of Freedom that tops that dome. At Lincoln's first inauguration, Philip Reed, like many of the workers who built the Capitol and the White House, was a slave. Now, as Lincoln began his second term, Reed was a free man. His bondage ended 2 years earlier when Lincoln signed that bill ending slavery in the nation's capital. Reporter Noah Brooks, a friend of Lincoln, saw what many others attending the second inaugural remarked about. He wrote that just as Lincoln stepped forward to take the oath of office, the sun, which had been obscured by rain clouds, burst forth in splendor. Lincoln saw it too. The next day he asked Brooks, "Did you notice that sunburst? It made my heart jump." When I walk into the Capitol Rotunda, I pass a handsome statue of Lincoln carved by a young woman named Vinnie Ream, another of the artists allowed into the White House to make life sketches of the president. Vinnie Ream sculpted her marble Lincoln at the astonishingly young age of 18. She remains the youngest artist and only woman ever commissioned by the U.S. Senate to create a statue, and her Lincoln remains a highlight among the Rotunda's jewels. I was in that same Rotunda in 1997 to see Nelson Mandela awarded the Congressional Gold Medal, the highest honor Congress can bestow on a civilian. On that day, the dark bronze bust of Martin Luther King, Jr. had been moved from the other side of the rotunda so that Lincoln and King appeared to preside together over that ceremony. It was an overcast afternoon, but as President Mandela started to speak, rays of sunlight began to pour into the rotunda. They illuminated the base of the statues first and rose gradually until by the time President Mandela finished speaking, both Lincoln and King were bathed in bright sunlight. With little imagination, you could almost hear Abraham Lincoln asking, "Did you notice that sunburst? It made my heart jump." I want to tell you about one more painting before I close. One of the most historic in the Capitol and one that I see 25 times a day. This is the first reading of the Emancipation Proclamation by Francis Bicknell Carpenter. It hangs in the west staircase of the Capitol between my office on the 3rd floor and the chamber on the 2nd floor. Like Lincoln, Francis Bicknell Carpenter believed the Emancipation Proclamation. I think you're going to see a picture of it over here. And there I am, coming down the staircase. Like Lincoln, Francis Bicknell Carpenter believed that the Emancipation Proclamation was the greatest act of Lincoln's presidency. For 6 months in 1864, Lincoln allowed him to work out of the White House, painting the president and his cabinet officers as they appeared when Lincoln first read them the historic decree. Lincoln took a great interest in Carpenter's work and pronounced the finished canvas absolutely perfect. A dozen years after the great emancipator's death, a wealthy New York philanthropist purchased the painting from Carpenter for $25,000 and donated it to the Senate. Her gift was unveiled in the House chamber during a joint session in 1878, 133 years ago tonight. The presentation ceremony featured 2 special speakers. The first was a congressman and Civil War veteran from Ohio named James Garfield, who would become America's second martyred president. Incidentally, I commend Candace Millard's new book, Destiny of the Republic, which gives a great account of Garfield in his last days. The other speaker was an old friend of the slain president from the days the two had served in the House, Alexander H. Stephens. The war had pulled the two men apart, and Stephens had served as vice president of the Confederacy. With the guns of war now silent, Stephens, now pale, emaciated, and too weak to stand, said he believed it was his duty to support his state when it seceded, but he never lost hope that a new union would one day emerge, and that the achievements of the reunited states would exceed anything yet accomplished by America. He ended by saying, "All of this is possible if the hearts of the people are right. It is my earnest wish to see it." Immediately, the old man was surrounded by well-wishers, and among them, extending his hand in congratulations, was the Marshal of the District of Columbia, the great abolitionist leader, Frederick Douglass. At times when agreement and unity of purpose seem elusive, I draw inspiration from the image of that reconciliation. Like Alexander Stephens, I believe that the achievements of a reunited states can indeed exceed the glories of our past. Before I close, I have one last thing to say. A number of you have been kind enough to ask about my colleague, Senator Mark Kirk, There's good news. He is making steady progress, and he was transferred this last week to the Rehabilitation Institute of Chicago, which is one of the best in the world. I am fully confident that Mark is going to make a full recovery, and I will express to him the well wishes of this gathering this evening and so many of you who brought it up. I thank you for that very much. Let me close by saying, as I said, there never was a Senator Lincoln, but I and all the 1,480 men and women who have been honored to serve in the Senate since Congressman and President Lincoln strode the hall of Congress walk in his footsteps. And disappointed as Lincoln must have been to have lost his own Senate race, it was all for the best. For had Lincoln won that race in 1858, it really seems unlikely that he could have achieved the presidency just 2 short years later, when America needed his genius and courage to serve. After all, can anyone imagine a lawyer from Illinois being elected President of the United States after serving less than a full term in the United States Senate? Thank you.
You're watching the Illinois Channel, an independent nonprofit corporation formed to provide gavel-to-gavel coverage of Illinois state government and other public affairs events taking place across Illinois.